August 17, 1944. Camp Forrest, Tennessee. The humidity pressed down like a wet blanket, turning the air into something you could almost chew. Underofficer Ernst Bachmann of the 352nd Infantry Division wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirt-stained hand, still unable to grasp that 6 months ago he had been firing at American soldiers on the beaches of Normandy. Now he sat on a wooden bench outside the mess hall, about to witness something that would fracture every belief he held about civilization, agriculture, and what separated humans from livestock. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The American guards had been grinning all afternoon, speaking in rapid English that Bachmann and his fellow prisoners could barely follow. Something about a harvest celebration, something about a special dinner that evening. Bachmann had learned not to expect much. In the Wehrmacht, special meals meant an extra slice of black bread or perhaps a thin soup with actual chunks of potato floating in the broth. The concept of celebration food had become abstract during his 3 years of military service, something remembered from childhood but no longer part of lived reality. At 1800 hours, the mess hall doors swung open and the prisoners filed inside, their boots scraping against clean wooden floors that still smelled faintly of pine and fresh paint. The building itself remained a source of constant amazement. In Germany, such construction would have required permits from 3 different Reich ministries and materials that simply did not exist outside of critical military projects. Here in Tennessee, the Americans had erected these structures in a matter of weeks, treating lumber as if forests were infinite and nails grew on trees. The tables had been set differently than usual. Instead of the standard metal trays divided into compartments, each place setting included a regular plate, a knife, a fork, and something else. Small 2-pronged implements that looked like miniature pitchforks. Bachmann picked one up, turning it over in his calloused hands. The metal was solid, well-made, stamped with a manufacturer's mark that suggested mass production on a scale that Germany had never achieved even in peacetime. Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann, who had surrendered alongside Bachmann in the chaos after D-Day, leaned over from the adjacent seat. His voice carried the thick accent of rural Bavaria, the kind of German that made educated Berliners wince. "What do you suppose these are for?" "Looks like something my grandfather used to spear hay bales." Before Bachmann could respond, American soldiers began emerging from the kitchen carrying large metal trays. Steam rose from the contents, and the smell that preceded them made Bachmann's stomach clench with an almost painful anticipation. Roasted meat. Real butter. Something sweet and earthy that he could not immediately identify. The guards moved between the tables with an efficiency that spoke to practiced routine, placing the trays down with casual abundance that seemed obscene to men who had spent years watching quartermasters count individual potatoes. Then Bachmann saw it. Among the sliced ham and the bowls of what appeared to be mashed potatoes swimming in real butter, among the fresh bread and the pitchers of cold milk that would have been luxury enough on their own, there were dozens of golden cylinders, each roughly the length of a man's hand. They glistened with melted butter, dotted with small kernels that caught the electric lights overhead. The smell rising from them was sweet and savory at once, completely unlike anything in Bachmann's experience. Sergeant William Harrison, one of the camp guards who had made an effort to learn basic German, noticed the confusion spreading across the prisoners' faces. He picked up one of the golden cylinders with his bare hands, holding it by the ends, and brought it to his mouth. Then, in a gesture that made every German in the room freeze in collective horror, he opened his mouth wide and dragged his teeth across the surface, tearing away the yellow kernels and chewing with obvious satisfaction. The mess hall fell silent except for the mechanical hum of the electric fans overhead. 200 German soldiers sat motionless, watching an American guard eat corn directly off the cob like a barn animal at feeding time. Bachmann felt his worldview tilting on its axis. In Germany, corn was animal feed. Schweinfutter. Pig food. The coarse grain that farmers threw to livestock, ground into meal for the cheapest bread, or fermented into the kind of alcohol that only desperate men would drink. No civilized person ate corn kernels. Certainly no civilized person ate them directly from the cob, using their teeth like a cow grazing in a pasture. The very act violated every principle of European table manners that Bachmann had been taught since childhood. You used utensils. You cut your food into appropriate portions. You did not gnaw on your dinner like a beast in a field. Sergeant Harrison, apparently oblivious to the cultural earthquake he had triggered, wiped butter from his chin and grinned at the stunned Germans. He gestured to the corn, then to his mouth, then gave an enthusiastic thumbs up. Gut. Sehr gut, he attempted in broken German, his accent mangling the words into near incomprehensibility. You eat fresh corn from farm this morning. Bachmann looked down at the golden cylinder on his plate. Up close, he could see that each kernel was plump and perfect, arranged in neat rows that demonstrated agricultural precision beyond anything he had witnessed in German farming. The butter pooled in the grooves between the rows, and salt crystals caught the light like tiny diamonds. His stomach growled with a ferocity that embarrassed him. Hunger had become his constant companion over the past year, a gnawing presence that never quite left, even here in American captivity where the meals were more substantial than anything he had eaten in the Wehrmacht. Klaus Zimmermann leaned over again, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried an edge of genuine distress. Ernst, they cannot be serious. This is what they feed to pigs in Garmisch. My father would have beaten me for even suggesting we eat such a thing. But Bachmann had learned something during his months in American captivity. The Americans did not operate according to European logic. They wasted water as if rivers were infinite. They threw away bread that would have fed a German family for days. They heated their buildings to temperatures that would have required a month's coal ration back home. If they claimed that corn was food, perhaps in this strange, abundant land, it actually was. He picked up the corn cob, mimicking Sergeant Harrison's grip. The surface was hot enough to make his fingers tingle, and the butter made it slippery. Several Germans at nearby tables were watching him, their expressions hovering between curiosity and disgust. Bachmann had never been a leader in the military sense. He had followed orders, kept his head down, survived. But someone had to be first. He brought the corn to his mouth, opened his jaw wide, and bit down. The explosion of flavor that hit his tongue made him gasp. Sweetness, but not the cloying artificial sweetness of saccharin or the thin sweetness of sugar beets. This was rich and complex, mixed with the salt and butter into something that tasted like summer itself, like sunshine converted into edible form. The kernels burst between his teeth, releasing juice that was almost decadent in its freshness. The texture was firm but yielded easily, nothing like the tough, starchy grain he associated with animal feed. Bachmann took another bite, then another, unable to stop himself. Around the mess hall, other prisoners were tentatively lifting their own corn cobs, watching him for cues. Klaus Zimmermann, always the cautious one, used his fork to pry individual kernels off, eating them one at a time as if this might preserve some shred of dignity. But dignity was a luxury that hunger could not afford. Within minutes, the mess hall filled with the sound of teeth scraping against corn cobs, of men eating with a focused intensity that went beyond mere consumption. This was revelation. This was the moment when everything they had been told about American barbarism, about American poverty, about American inability to properly utilize agricultural resources, crumbled like the stale bread they had eaten in their final days at the Normandy front. If Americans ate corn like this, served fresh and sweet and drowning in butter, what else had been lies? If animal feed could taste like this, what did that say about the food they had been told was fit for human consumption? If prisoners of war were served butter and milk and fresh vegetables while Germany's own citizens stood in ration lines for turnips and sawdust bread, what did that reveal about the true balance of this war? Bachmann finished his first ear of corn and reached for a second. No one stopped him. The American guards simply brought out more trays, more golden cylinders glistening with fat, more of this impossible abundance. He watched Klaus Zimmermann abandon his fork and pick up the corn cob with both hands, all pretense of civilized table manners forgotten in the face of actual sustenance. Oberstfreiter Franz Weber, a veteran of the Russian front who had somehow survived both Stalingrad and Normandy, sat at the far end of the table with tears streaming down his weathered face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He was not sobbing, not making any sound at all, but the tears flowed freely as he methodically worked his way through his third ear of corn. Bachmann understood. This was not just food. This was evidence. This was proof that everything they had sacrificed, everything they had suffered, everything they had believed about German superiority and the necessity of conquest, had been built on foundations of sand. Sergeant Harrison walked between the tables, clearly pleased with the success of his cultural experiment. He stopped beside Bachmann and gestured at the empty corn cob on his plate. Good, yes? American corn. Best in world. His German was atrocious, but his meaning was clear. This was not just food. This was a statement of national pride, a demonstration of agricultural supremacy delivered through butter-soaked kernels that no propaganda minister could have countered with words. After the meal concluded, after the prisoners had consumed enough corn to have fed every pig in Bavaria, they filed back to their barracks in unusual silence. The evening air had cooled slightly, and cicadas sang in the oak trees that lined the camp's perimeter. Bachmann sat on his bunk, a thin mattress that was nevertheless more comfortable than anything he had slept on during his military service, and tried to process what had just occurred. The barracks were better constructed than many German civilian homes. Electric lighting illuminated every corner, driving away the shadows that had been constant companions in Wehrmacht quarters. Running water flowed from actual faucets, hot and cold, available at any hour. The latrines had flush toilets, porcelain and chrome, maintained to standards that exceeded what Bachmann's family had possessed before the war. This was a prison camp. This was where America kept its enemies. And it was cleaner, safer, and more comfortable than the accommodations provided to Germany's own soldiers. Klaus Zimmermann climbed onto the bunk above, his weight making the wooden frame creak. His voice came from the darkness, thoughtful in a way that was rare for the usually jovial Bavarian. My father grew corn. 3 hectares behind the main house. Every autumn we harvested it, dried it, ground it for the pigs. When times were desperate, my mother made bread from corn flour. It was gray and dense, tasted like paste, gave you stomach cramps if you ate too much. We considered it emergency food, something to keep us alive when the wheat failed. He paused, and Bachmann heard him shift position above. Tonight I ate corn that tasted better than the Christmas goose we had in '38, the last good year before everything started. How is that possible, Ernst? How can the same plant produce pig fodder in Bavaria and delicacies in Tennessee? What does that mean about everything we thought we knew? Bachmann had no answer. He lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of 200 men processing the same cognitive dissonance, the same fundamental challenge to their understanding of reality. Outside, American guards walked their patrols, their boots crunching on gravel paths that were maintained with a precision that would have impressed a Prussian drill sergeant. The guard towers stood dark against the summer stars, searchlights sweeping predictable patterns that somehow felt less threatening than protective. Sleep came slowly that night, interrupted by dreams of golden fields stretching to horizons, of abundance so vast that it could be shared with enemies, of a civilization that had somehow achieved what German efficiency and discipline had failed to produce. When morning came, the breakfast included fresh eggs, bacon fried to crispy perfection, toast made from white flour, and coffee so strong and rich that it bore no resemblance to the chicory substitute that had been standard in the Wehrmacht. But Bachmann barely tasted it. His mind remained fixed on those corn cobs, on the casual way Sergeant Harrison had bitten into one, on the revelation that what Germany fed to animals, America served to prisoners with butter and salt, and the presumption that this was normal, unremarkable, simply how civilized people ate. The corn had been delivered that morning from a local farm, Sergeant Harrison had said. This morning. Which meant somewhere nearby, probably within a few kilometers of the camp, American farmers were producing fresh corn in such quantities that military camps could serve it to prisoners of war without rationing, without careful measurement, without the bureaucratic apparatus that governed every gram of food in Germany. Over the following days, Bachmann found himself paying closer attention to the food served in the mess hall. Every meal brought new revelations. Fresh milk arrived daily, not the watered-down substitute that German civilians had learned to tolerate, but thick cream that left white mustaches and tasted of actual cows. Beef appeared on the menu 3 times per week, cuts of meat that would have required black market connections in Berlin. Chicken, pork, fish brought from the coast packed in ice that somehow did not melt during the journey. The variety staggered him. In the Wehrmacht, meals had fallen into predictable patterns. Thin soup. Hard bread. Occasional sausage that contained more filler than meat. Potatoes when available, turnips when they were not. The monotony had been part of military life, accepted as necessary sacrifice for the war effort. But here, in a camp designed to hold enemies, the menu changed daily. Roasted vegetables he had never seen before. Salads with fresh lettuce and tomatoes. Desserts that included actual sugar, real chocolate, pies filled with fruit that had not been preserved in questionable chemicals. The camp canteen, which prisoners could access using script earned through labor details, offered additional wonders. Candy bars wrapped in colorful paper, each one containing more sugar than a German civilian's monthly ration. Soft drinks served cold, fizzing with carbonation that tickled the throat. Cigarettes of such quality that even non-smokers began purchasing them, not to smoke but to hold, to possess, to confirm that such luxury items actually existed and were available to prisoners. Bachmann volunteered for a work detail at a nearby farm, partly for the additional script it provided, partly because he needed to see where this abundance came from. The farm, owned by a man named Joe Mitchell, occupied a valley about 5 kilometers from Camp Forrest. Rolling fields stretched in every direction, mechanized cultivation on a scale that made German agricultural methods seem medieval by comparison. Mitchell operated a John Deere tractor that could plow in a single day what would have taken a team of horses a week to accomplish. The machine ran on gasoline that apparently flowed freely, without ration cards or permits or bureaucratic approvals. Mitchell drove it with casual confidence, speaking to the German prisoners in slow English supplemented with exaggerated gestures, treating enemy soldiers like temporary farmhands rather than threats to be guarded. The cornfields were the revelation Bachmann had both expected and dreaded. Row after perfect row stretched toward the horizon, each stalk thick and healthy, each ear heavy with kernels. Mitchell walked between the rows with proprietary pride, pulling back husks to show the German prisoners what proper cultivation could achieve. The ears were enormous, far larger than anything Bachmann had seen in Bavaria, each kernel plump and sweet-smelling even before cooking. Through a combination of broken English, hand gestures, and drawings in the dirt, Mitchell explained his methods. Hybrid seeds developed by university researchers. Chemical fertilizers that provided exact nutritional requirements. Crop rotation systems that restored soil fertility. Irrigation during dry periods, drainage during wet ones. The scientific precision of it all made Bachmann's head spin. In Germany, farming was tradition. You planted what your father had planted, used methods your grandfather had used, hoped for favorable weather and accepted poor harvests as God's will. Here, in Tennessee, farming was engineering. Mitchell showed them charts tracking rainfall, soil composition, growing degree days. He consulted almanacs and university extension bulletins. He invested in machinery that cost more than a German farmer would earn in 5 years. And the results spoke for themselves. Mitchell's corn fields produced yields that exceeded German averages by factors that seemed mathematically impossible. During lunch break, Mitchell's wife brought food to the workers. The meal included sandwiches made with actual ham and cheese, fresh fruit, and of course, corn on the cob. She served the German prisoners the same portions she gave the American workers, the same quality, the same generous abundance. No one supervised to ensure the prisoners did not take too much. No one counted to verify fair distribution. The assumption seemed to be that there was enough for everyone, that scarcity was not a factor that needed to be managed. Bachmann ate his corn on the cob sitting under an oak tree, watching Klaus Zimmermann demonstrate proper German table manners by carefully cutting the kernels off with a knife before eating them with a fork. The Bavarians' resistance to eating corn directly had become something of a running joke among the prisoners, a stubborn adherence to European propriety in the face of overwhelming evidence that American methods worked better. But even Klaus could not deny the taste. After finishing his carefully curated kernels, he picked up the cob and bit into it directly, abandoning a lifetime of conditioning in favor of practical efficiency. He looked at Bachmann with something approaching betrayal in his eyes, as if proper manners should have been sufficient armor against American abundance. They were not. Franz Weber, the Stalingrad veteran, had integrated into the work detail with grim efficiency. He operated machinery with the same methodical precision he had once applied to maintaining machine guns in frozen trenches. During breaks, he spoke little, but his eyes constantly scanned the fields, the equipment, the casual wealth that surrounded them. One afternoon, while the group rested in the shade of Mitchell's barn, Weber finally articulated what many were thinking. In Russia, I watched men starve while defending grain elevators full of wheat that was being shipped to Germany. I watched civilians fight over potato peelings in villages we occupied. I saw the economics of conquest, the arithmetic of taking from those who had little to feed an army that had less. He paused, pulling a blade of grass from the ground and examining it as if it might contain answers. Here, they give corn to prisoners. Fresh corn, with butter. They do this while fighting a war on two fronts, while supplying armies across two oceans, while apparently maintaining civilian prosperity that exceeds our peacetime standards. How? How is this possible? No one had an answer. The question hung in the summer air, mixing with the smell of growing crops and the distant sound of Mitchell's tractor cultivating another field. The mathematics of it all defied everything Bachmann had been taught about resource management, about the necessity of conquest for survival, about the zero-sum nature of international relations. If America could feed its prisoners so well while simultaneously fighting Germany and Japan, while supplying Britain and Russia, while maintaining domestic abundance, then what did that say about German claims of living space necessity? What did it reveal about the economic arguments that had justified invasion and occupation? The corn was not just food. It was evidence of a systematic failure in German understanding of industrial civilization, of democratic efficiency, of what free societies could achieve when properly organized. The educational programs established at Camp Forrest provided Bachmann with frameworks to understand what the corn represented. University correspondence courses arrived weekly, materials prepared by professors at institutions whose names carried weight even in Germany. The economics lectures particularly challenged everything he had absorbed during his years in the Hitler Youth and Wehrmacht indoctrination sessions. Professor Margaret Chen from Northwestern University had designed a curriculum specifically addressing resource allocation in democratic versus authoritarian systems. Her lessons used agricultural production as primary evidence, comparing yields, distribution efficiency, and civilian nutrition across different governmental structures. The data was irrefutable and damning. American farmers, working independently with market incentives and technological support, produced more per hectare than German collective efforts achieved through central planning and mandatory quotas. The corn that had shocked Bachmann into awareness was merely one visible manifestation of systematic advantages built into democratic capitalism. The hybrid seeds came from competitive research programs where universities and private companies vied to develop superior products. The fertilizers emerged from chemical industries operating under profit motives rather than state directives. The machinery reflected engineering innovation driven by farmers demanding better tools, manufacturers competing for sales, and a financial system that made capital investment feasible for individual agricultural producers. Klaus Zimmermann struggled with these concepts more than most. His Bavarian upbringing had instilled deep skepticism toward abstract economic theory, preferring concrete tradition over complicated explanations. But even Klaus could not ignore the evidence arriving daily on their plates. The mess hall served fresh vegetables that German civilians had not seen since before the war. Strawberries in season, their sweetness almost painful to men whose taste buds had forgotten such intensity. Watermelon, a fruit Bachmann had only read about, served in thick slices that dripped juice and required no rationing despite their apparent luxury. The camp's 4th of July celebration in 1945 brought additional revelations, though by then the war in Europe had ended and the prisoners understood they were no longer combatants but guests awaiting repatriation to a Germany that existed only in ruins. The Americans organized festivities that included prisoners as participants rather than observers. Baseball games where guards and Germans played on mixed teams, their laughter transcending language barriers. A barbecue featuring beef in quantities that would have fed a Wehrmacht company for a week, served casually on paper plates that were then discarded as if materials were unlimited. And corn. Mountains of corn, roasted over open flames until the husks charred black and the kernels inside steamed in their own moisture. Bachmann had become proficient at eating corn directly from the cob, his initial revulsion completely erased by months of exposure to American agricultural abundance. He sat with Franz Weber and Klaus Zimmermann, working through their fourth ears each, butter running down their wrists, no longer caring about the European table manners that had once seemed so important. Weber, normally taciturn, spoke between bites. His voice carried the flatness of someone stating obvious facts rather than offering opinions. When we return to Germany, no one will believe us. We will tell them about corn served to prisoners, about beef and butter and sugar available in camp canteens, about farmers who own machinery worth more than entire German villages. They will think we are lying or that captivity damaged our minds. How do you convince people of abundance they have never imagined? The question had no good answer. Letters home to Germany often returned marked as undeliverable, the addresses destroyed by Allied bombing or Soviet occupation. The few responses that did arrive described conditions that made pre-war poverty seem prosperous by comparison. Families living in rubble, subsisting on rations that provided barely enough calories to sustain life. Cities without infrastructure, economies without currency, societies without hope. The contrast between prisoner reports of American plenty and family descriptions of German devastation created cognitive dissonance that some prisoners simply could not process. A few retreated into denial, insisting that American abundance was temporary or somehow artificial, that the true economic balance would reveal itself eventually. But most, like Bachmann, accepted the evidence their senses provided and began constructing new worldviews built on foundations of observed reality rather than ideological instruction. The camp library offered additional education through access to materials that had been banned or unavailable in Nazi Germany. Bachmann discovered John Steinbeck's descriptions of American agricultural abundance, Mark Twain's satire of American social pretensions, economic textbooks explaining market systems that competed directly with Nazi command economy theories. The freedom to read these materials, to discuss them openly, to form conclusions without official guidance, represented intellectual liberation as profound as the physical sensation of eating fresh corn. Religious services conducted by American chaplains and qualified German prisoners provided another avenue for processing transformation. Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest who served multiple camps in Tennessee, offered counseling that went beyond spiritual matters into questions of moral responsibility and cultural understanding. His sermons, delivered in fluent German learned during seminary studies in Austria, addressed the gap between Nazi ideology and Christian teaching without direct condemnation, allowing prisoners to reach their own conclusions about complicity and redemption. Bachmann attended services more from habit than faith, his religious conviction damaged by years of seeing prayers fail to stop bullets or prevent starvation. But O'Brien's approach differed from the military chaplains he had known in the Wehrmacht. The priest treated prisoners as individuals capable of moral reasoning rather than subjects requiring instruction. He offered books, encouraged questions, and created space for doubt that totalitarian systems could never permit. One afternoon after services, Bachmann found himself in extended conversation with O'Brien about the corn that had triggered his initial awakening. The priest listened carefully, nodding occasionally, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. When Bachmann finished explaining his confusion about why German corn was animal feed while American corn was human delicacy, O'Brien smiled with what seemed like recognition. "It is the same plant," the priest said, his German carrying slight Austrian inflections. "The difference is not biological but cultural and technological. In Europe, corn cultivation remained traditional, methods passed down without significant innovation, yields accepted as natural limits. In America, corn became subject to scientific agriculture, systematic improvement, investment in research and development. The plant responds to different treatment with different results. Perhaps societies work similarly. The analogy was not subtle, but Bachmann appreciated the directness. The corn was metaphor and evidence simultaneously. What you invested in cultivation determined what you harvested. What you believed about improvement possibilities shaped what you achieved. Systems that encouraged innovation produced abundance. Systems that enforced conformity produced scarcity. The lesson seemed almost childishly simple, yet it explained the material differences between American and German societies more effectively than elaborate economic theories. As summer turned to autumn in 1945, news arrived that repatriation would begin soon. The prospect filled Bachmann with complicated emotions. Germany was home, family, everything familiar. But Germany was also ruins, occupation, starvation, and collective guilt for crimes that newsreels and photographs had made undeniable. The concentration camp footage particularly haunted prisoners who had believed they were fighting for civilization against barbarism, only to discover that barbarism wore German uniforms and spoke German commands. The final weeks at Camp Forrest took on a valedictory quality. Prisoners who had formed friendships with American guards exchanged addresses, promising to write despite knowing that destroyed German postal systems made correspondence unlikely. Educational programs accelerated, as if American authorities wanted to pack as much democratic indoctrination as possible into remaining time. Work details continued, but with less supervision, guards trusting prisoners who no longer had reasons to escape into a country that had demonstrated only kindness toward enemies. The farewell dinner organized by camp authorities exceeded even the 4th of July celebration in its abundance. Every item that had amazed German prisoners during their captivity appeared on tables decorated with American and German flags positioned as equals rather than victor and vanquished. Roasted turkey, glazed ham, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, fresh vegetables prepared in styles that had become familiar, and of course, corn on the cob served with butter and salt and the casual assumption that everyone would eat it directly without embarrassment. Bachmann sat between Klaus Zimmermann and Franz Weber, eating slowly, trying to memorize flavors that might not exist in occupied Germany. Around them, 200 German prisoners consumed American food with practiced efficiency, their table manners now thoroughly Americanized despite years of European conditioning. The transformation was complete. They had arrived as Nazi soldiers, convinced of German superiority and American weakness. They departed as men who had tasted abundance, witnessed democratic efficiency, and learned that propaganda could not survive prolonged contact with observable reality. Sergeant Harrison, who had first demonstrated corn eating that shocking August evening 2 years earlier, moved between tables distributing small American flags as keepsakes. His German had improved substantially, allowing actual conversations rather than gesture-based communication. He stopped beside Bachmann, placing a flag on the table with ceremonial care. "You remember first corn?" Harrison asked, his accent still thick but his meaning clear. "You looked like I offered poison. Now you eat like born in Iowa." He grinned, clearly pleased with the cultural conversion he had facilitated. "Take flag. Remember America not enemy, just different. Remember democracy works, even if strange at first." The repatriation journey began in early November, prisoner trains rolling northward toward ports where Liberty ships waited to reverse the voyage that had brought German soldiers to American captivity. The trains were the same comfortable passenger coaches that had carried prisoners inland years earlier, the dining service maintained the same standards, and the American guards treated their charges with the same casual respect that had characterized the entire imprisonment experience. Bachmann watched Tennessee countryside pass beyond the windows, fields harvested clean, farmhouses prosperous, towns intact and functioning. The contrast with newsreel footage of German cities reduced to rubble could not have been starker. America had fought a global war while maintaining domestic prosperity. Germany had conquered half of Europe while starving its own citizens. The economic and moral mathematics were undeniable. The ship that carried prisoners back across the Atlantic was crowded but well provisioned, Navy cooks maintaining the nutritional standards that prisoners had learned to expect. The final dinner before landing in Bremerhaven included canned corn, the kernels smaller and less sweet than fresh corn but still recognizable as food rather than animal feed. Bachmann ate his portion mechanically, knowing that this might be the last corn he tasted for years or possibly forever. Germany in late 1945 was every nightmare the prisoners had imagined and worse. Cities existed only as suggestions in rubble fields. Infrastructure had ceased functioning. Currency meant nothing when no goods existed to purchase. The occupation authorities, American, British, French, and Soviet, governed zones that bore little resemblance to the nation prisoners remembered. Bachmann made his way to Stuttgart, where his family had lived before the war. The address existed only as approximate location in a debris field where streets no longer had clear boundaries. He found his mother and younger sister living in a basement room, surviving on occupation rations that provided barely enough calories to prevent starvation. Their joy at his survival mixed with incomprehension when he tried to explain his captivity experience. His mother, aged beyond her years by war and deprivation, listened to his stories about corn on the cob with polite disbelief. "Ernst, captivity must have been difficult. Such fantasies are understandable given the stress." She patted his hand with maternal concern, clearly convinced that prison had damaged his grip on reality. How could he explain abundance to someone whose daily struggle was finding enough potato peels to make soup? His sister, 16 now and barely recognizable from the child he remembered, asked practical questions about American food. Could he describe the taste? Were the portions really as large as he claimed? Did prisoners actually have access to butter and sugar and meat? Her hunger made the questions urgent rather than curious. Bachmann tried to explain, but words failed to bridge the gap between experienced abundance and theoretical plenty. Over the following months and years, as Germany slowly reconstructed under Marshall Plan assistance that brought American resources and organizational methods to European recovery, Bachmann found himself repeatedly returning to that first corn on the cob. The moment when everything changed, when assumptions shattered, when reality forced ideology to surrender. He had bitten into corn expecting animal feed and tasted civilization instead, discovering that advancement was not about racial superiority or military conquest but about systems that encouraged innovation, rewarded productivity, and shared results broadly. He settled in Stuttgart's American occupation zone, working first as translator for military government offices, later as liaison helping German businesses understand American commercial practices. His experience in American captivity became valuable credential, proof that he understood how democratic systems operated, how abundance was generated, how free markets coordinated individual efforts into collective prosperity. Klaus Zimmermann returned to Bavaria, taking over his family farm and immediately implementing American agricultural methods learned during work details. He imported hybrid corn seeds, invested in fertilization programs, and shocked his neighbors by planting corn for human consumption rather than animal feed. The first harvest proved the concept. His corn, grown using Tennessee techniques, produced yields and quality that made traditional methods obsolete. Within 5 years, Bavarian farmers were eating corn on the cob at harvest festivals, the stigma of pig food completely erased by demonstrated results. Franz Weber, the Stalingrad veteran, never fully recovered from what he had seen and done during the war. But he channeled his demons into advocacy for German-American friendship, giving lectures about his captivity experience to school groups and civic organizations. His message was consistent and simple. American abundance was not accident or propaganda but systematic result of democratic values and free market efficiency. Germany could achieve similar prosperity by adopting similar systems, abandoning authoritarian impulses in favor of individual liberty and competitive innovation. The corn that had shocked German prisoners in Tennessee camps became symbol and metaphor for the transformation that reshaped post-war Germany. What had been animal feed became gourmet item. What had been cultural marker of backwardness became evidence of agricultural sophistication. The change was not merely botanical but philosophical, representing fundamental shift from tradition-bound scarcity thinking to innovation-driven abundance mentality. Decades later, when Bachmann was old and Germany had become prosperous democracy integrated into Western alliance systems, he still remembered that first bite of corn on the cob with perfect clarity. The sweetness, the butter, the shock of discovering that everything he had believed about civilization was inverted. America had defeated Germany not just with superior weapons and industrial capacity but with ideas and systems that produced abundance rather than scarcity, freedom rather than coercion, hope rather than fear. The corn had been more than food. It had been education, revelation, and prophecy. One bite had contained the future, demonstrating that societies built on democratic principles and free market efficiency would always defeat authoritarian systems that relied on conquest and control. The lesson had been delivered not through propaganda or coercion but through the simple act of sharing abundance with enemies, trusting that human beings exposed to better alternatives would choose freedom over tyranny, prosperity over ideology, corn on the cob over the lies they had been fed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.